Bajin and Lays, the Dead Sea Scrolls Deception. Chapter 11. The Essenes. The reader by now will be familiar with the conclusions of the consensus view of the international team, and as expressed through its journals by École Biblique, as well as with the processes by which those conclusions were reached. It is now time to return to the evidence and see whether any alternative conclusions are possible. In order to do so, certain basic questions must again be posed. Who precisely were the elusive and mysterious denizens of Qumran who established their community, transcribed and deposited their sacred texts, then apparently vanished from the stage of history? Were they indeed Essenes? And if so, what exactly does that term mean? The traditional images of the Essenes come down to us from Pliny, Philo, and Josephus, who described them as a sect or subsect of first-century Judaism. Pliny, as we have seen, depicted the Essenes as celibate hermits, residing with only palm trees for company, in an area that might be construed as Qumran. Josephus, who is echoed by Philo, elaborates on this portrait. According to Josephus, the Essenes are celibate, although he adds almost as an afterthought there is a second order of Essenes who do marry. The Essenes despise pleasure and wealth. They hold all possessions in common, and those who join their ranks must renounce private property. They elect their own leaders from amongst themselves. They are settled in every city of Palestine, as well as in isolated communities, but even in urban surroundings keep themselves apart. Josephus portrays the Essenes as something akin to a monastic order or an ancient mystery school. Postulants to their ranks are subjected to a 3-year period of probation, the equivalent of a novitiate. Postulants to their ranks are subjected to a 3-year period of probation, the equivalent of a novitiate. Not only he has successfully undergone this apprenticeship is the candidate officially accepted. Not until he has successfully undergone this apprenticeship is the candidate officially accepted. Full-fledged Essenes pray before dawn, then work for 5 hours, after which they don a clean loincloth and bathe. A ritual of purification performed daily. Thus purified, they assemble in a special common room and partake of a simple communal meal. Contrary to later popular misconceptions, Josephus does not describe the Essenes as vegetarian. They are said to eat meat. The Essenes, Josephus says, are well versed in the books of the Old Testament and the teachings of the prophets. They are themselves trained in the arts of divination and can foretell the future by studying sacred texts in conjunction with certain rites of purification. In their doctrine, according to Josephus, the soul is immortal, but trapped in the prison of the mortal and corruptive body. At death, the soul is set free and soars upwards. Rejoicing, Josephus compares At death, the soul is set free and soars upwards. Rejoicing. Josephus compares Essene teaching to that of the Greeks. Elsewhere, he is more specific, likening it to the principles of the Pythagorean scrolls. Josephus mentions Essene adherence to the law of Moses. What they reverence most after God is the lawgiver, and blasphemy against him is a capital offense. On the whole, however, the Essenes are portrayed as pacifist and on good terms with established authority. Indeed, they are said to enjoy the special favor of Herod, who continued to honor all the Essenes. Herod had these Essenes in such honor that and thought higher of them than their mortal nature required. But at one point Josephus contradicts himself, or perhaps slips his guard. The Essenes, he says, despise danger and conquer pain to sheer willpower, death if it comes with honor. They value more than life without end. Their spirit was tested to the utmost by the war with the Romans, who racked and twisted, burnt and broke them, subjecting them to every torture yet invented in order to make them blaspheme the lawgiver or eat some forbidden food. In this one reference, at variance with everything else, Josephus says, his Essenes began to sound suspiciously like the militant defenders of Masada, the Zealots, or Sicarii. With the exception of this one reference, Josephus' account was to shape popular images of the Essenes for most of the ensuing 2,000 years. And when the Aufklärung, the so-called Enlightenment, began to encourage free thinking, examination of Christian tradition, commentators began to make connections between that tradition and Josephus's Essenes. Thus, in 1770, no less a personage than Frederick the Great wrote definitively that Jesus was really an Essene. He was imbued with Essene ethics. Such apparently scandalous assertions proceeded to gain increasing currency during the latter half of the next century, and in 1863, Renan published his famous Vide Jesu, in which he suggested that Christianity was an Essenism, which has largely succeeded. Towards the end of the 19th century, the revival of interest in esoteric thought consolidated the association of Christianity with the Essenes. Theosophy, through the teachings of H.P. Blavatsky, postulated Jesus as a magus, or adept, who embodied elements of both Essene and Gnostic tradition. One of Blavatsky's disciples, Anna Kingsford, developed a concept of esoteric Christianity. This roped in alchemy as well and portrayed Jesus as a Gnostic thaumaturge who, prior to his public mission, had lived and studied with the Essenes. In 1889, such ideas were transplanted to the continent through a book called The Great Initiate by the French Osophist Edouard Chayeur. The mystics surrounding the Essenes had by now began to associate them with healing, to credit them with special medical training, and to represent them as a Judaic equivalent of the Greek therapeutai. Another influential work, The Crucifixion by Eyewitness, which appeared in German towards the end of the 19th century and in English around 1907, purported to be a genuine ancient text composed by an Essene scribe. Jesus was depicted as the son of Mary and an unnamed Essene teacher, who funded the secret Essene medical knowledge enabled him not just to survive the crucifixion, but also to appear to his disciples afterwards as if risen from the dead. George Moore undoubtedly drew on this work when in 1916 he published the Book Kerith and scandalized Christian readers across the English-speaking world. Moore, too, portrayed Jesus as a protege of Essene thought, who survives the crucifixion and retires to an Essene community in the general vicinity of Qumran. Here, years later, he is visited by a fanatic named Paul, who, quite knowingly, has come to promulgate a bizarre, mythologized account of his career and, in the process, promote him to godhood. The Essenes depicted in the Bruch Karith derive ultimately from the stereotyped Essenes of Pliny, Josephus, and Philo, imbued now with a mystical character which endeared them to esoteric-oriented writers of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. To the extent that educated readers knew anything of the Essenes at all, this was the prevailing image of them, and something of this image was retained even by more critical commentators such as Robert Graves, who in other respects sought to demystify Christian origins. When the Dead Sea Scrolls came to light, they seemed, on the surface at least, not to contain anything that conflicted with the prevailing image of the Essenes. It was only natural, therefore, that they should be associated with the established conceptions. As early as 1947, when he first saw the Qumran text, Professor Sukenik had suggested an Essene character for their authorship. Father DeVoe and his team also invoked the traditional image of the Essenes. As we have noted, DeVoe was quick to identify Qumran with the Essene settlement mentioned by Pliny. The community at Qumran, Professor Cross concurred, was an Essene settlement. It soon became regarded as an established and accepted fact that the Dead Sea Scrolls were essentially Essene in their authorship, and that the Essenes were of the familiar kind: pacifist, ascetic, celibate, divorced from public and particularly political issues. The community at Qumran, the consensus view contends, was built upon the much earlier remains of an abandoned Israelite fortress dating from the 6th century BC. The authors of the scrolls arrived at the site sometime around 134 BC, and the major buildings were erected around 100 BC, and therefore a chronology safely and uncontroversially pre-Christian. The community was said to have thrived until it was decimated by an earthquake, followed by a fire in 31 BC. During the reign of Herod the Great, 37 to 4 BC, in brackets, Qumran was abandoned and deserted, and then, in the reign of Herod's successor, the ruins were reoccupied and rebuilding undertaken. According to the consensus, Qumran then flourished as a quietist, politically neutral, and disengaged enclave until it was destroyed by the Romans in AD 68, during the war that also involved the sack of Jerusalem. After this, the site was occupied by a Roman military garrison until the end of the 1st century. When Palestine rose in revolt again between AD 132 and 135, Qumran was inhabited by rebel squatters. It was a neat, conveniently formulated scenario, which effectively diffused the Dead Sea Scrolls of whatever explosive potential they might have. But the evidence seems to have been ignored when expediency and the stability of Christian theology so dictated. There is a contradiction quite apart from the geographical question in DeVoe's assertion that the passage from Pliny, quoted here on page 48, refers to Qumran, a contradiction which pertains to the dating of the scrolls. Pliny is referring in this passage to the situation after the destruction of Jerusalem. The passage itself indicates that En-Gedi has likewise been destroyed, which it was. The Essene community, however, is described as still intact, and even taken in a throng of refugees. Yet even Devoe acknowledged that Qumran, like Jerusalem and En-Gedi, was destroyed during the revolt of AD 66-73. It would thus seem even more unlikely that Pliny's Essene community is in fact Qumran. What is more, Pliny's community, as he describes it, contains no women, yet there are women's graves among those at Qumran. It is still, of course, possible that the occupants of Qumran were Essenes, if not of Pliny's community, then of some other. If so, however, the Dead Sea Scrolls will themselves reveal how ill-informed about the Essenes Pliny was. The term Essene is Greek. It occurs only in classical writers, Josephus, Philo, and Pliny, and is written in Greek as Essenoi, or Essay-oi. Well, which is it? Anyway, thus, if the inhabitants of Qumran were indeed Essenes, one would expect Essene to be a Greek translation or transliteration of some original Hebrew or Aramaic word by which the Qumran community referred to themselves. Accounts of the Essenes by classical writers are not consistent with the life or thought of the community as revealed by either the external evidence of archaeology or the internal evidence of the texts themselves. Josephus, Philo, and Pliny offer portraits of the Essenes which are often utterly irreconcilable with the testimony of Qumran's ruins and of the Dead Sea Scrolls. The evidence at Qumran, both internal and external, repeatedly contradicts their accounts. Some of these contradictions have been cited before, but it is worth reviewing the most important of them. Number 1. Josephus acknowledges that there is another order of Essenes who do marry, but this, he indicates, is atypical. In general, Josephus says, echoing Philo and Pliny, the Essenes are celibate, yet the graves of women and children have been found among those excavated at Qumran, and the community rule contains regulations governing marriage and the raising of children. Number 2. None of the classical writers ever mentions anything to suggest that the Essenes used a special form of calendar. The Qumran community, however, did, a unique solar-based calendar rather than a conventional Judaic calendar, which is lunar-based. If the Qumran community were indeed Essenes, surely so strikingly noticeable a characteristic would have been accorded some reference. Number 3. According to Philo, the Essenes differed from other forms of ancient Judaism in having no cult of animal sacrifices, yet the Temple Scroll issues precise instructions for such sacrifices, and the ruins of Qumran revealed animal bones carefully placed in pots or covered by pots and buried in the ground under thin covering of earth. Devoe speculated that these bones might be the remains of ritual meals. They might indeed, but they might equally be the remains of animal sacrifices, as stipulated by the Temple Scroll. Number 4. The classical writers use the term Essene to denote what they describe as a major subdivision of Judaism, along with the Pharisees and Sadducees. Nowhere in the Dead Sea Scrolls, however, is the term Essene found. Number 5. Josephus declares the Essenes to have been on congenial terms with Herod the Great, who, he says, had these Essenes in such honor and thought higher of them than their mortal nature required. Yet the Qumran literature indicates a militant hostility towards non-Judaic authorities in general, and towards Herod and his dynasty in particular. What is more, Qumran appears to have been abandoned and uninhabited for some years precisely because of persecution by Herod. Number 6. According to classical writers, the Essenes were pacifists. Philo specifically states that their numbers included no makers of weapons or armor. Josephus emphatically distinguishes between the nonviolent Essenes and the militantly messianic and nationalistic zealots. Yet the ruins of Qumran include a defensive tower of a manifest military nature, and what can only be described as a forge. As for the Qumran literature, it is often martial in the extreme, as exemplified by such texts as the War Scroll. Indeed, the bellicose character of such texts would seem to have less in common with what Josephus says of the Essenes than with what he and others say of the so-called Zealots, which is precisely what Roth and Driver claim the Qumran community to be, thereby incurring the fury of DeVoe and the international team. The Qumran community wrote mostly not in Greek but in Aramaic and Hebrew. So far as Aramaic and Hebrew are concerned, no accepted etymology for the origins of the term Essene has hitherto been found. Even the classical writers were mystified by its derivation. Philo, for example, suggested that in his opinion the name stemmed from the Greek word for holy, osios, and that the Essenes were therefore the Osiotes, or holy ones. One theory has enjoyed a certain qualified currency among some modern scholars, notably Gezi Vermes of Oxford University. According to Vermes, the term Essene derives from the Aramaic word Assyria, spelled A-S-S-A-Y-Y-A in the English transliteration, which means healers. This has fostered an image in some quarters of the Essenes as medical practitioners, a Judaic equivalent of the Alexandrian aesthetics known as the Therapeutai. But the word Assyria does not occur anywhere in the corpus of Qumran literature, nor is there any reference to healing, to medical activities, or the therapeutic work. To derive Essene from Assyria, therefore, remains purely speculative, and there would be no reason to credit it at all unless there were no other options. In fact, there is another option, not just a possibility, but a probability. If the Qumran community never refer to themselves as Essenes or Assyria, they do employ a number of other Hebrew and Aramaic terms. From these terms, it is clear that the community did not have a single definitive name for themselves. They did, however, have a highly distinctive and unique concept of themselves, and this concept is reflected by a variety of appellations and designations. The concept rests ultimately on the all-important covenant, which entailed a formal oath of obedience, totally and eternally, to the law of Moses. The authors of the Dead Sea Scrolls would thus refer to themselves as, for example, the keepers of the covenant. As synonyms for covenant and law, they would often use the same words that figure so prominently in Taoism: way, work, or works, measim in Hebrew. They would speak, for instance, of the perfect of the way, or the way of perfect righteousness. Way meaning the work of the law, or the way in which the law functions, the way in which the law works. Variations of these themes run all through the Dead Sea Scrolls to denote the Qumran community and its members. In the Habakkuk commentary, Eisenman, continuing this line of thought, found one particularly important such variation, the Oshe HaTorah, which translates as the doers of the law. This term would appear to be the source of the word Essene, for the collective form of Oseh HaTorah is Osim, pronounced Osim. Osim, pronounced Osim. The Qumran community would thus have constituted collectively the Osim. They seem, in fact, to have been known as such. An early Christian writer, Epiphanius, speaks of an allegedly heretical Judaic sect which once occupied an area around the Dead Sea. This sect, he says, were called the Essenes. It is fairly safe to conclude that the Essenes, of Epiphanius, and the Osim of the Qumran community were one and the same. Thus the authors of the Dead Sea Scrolls may be thought of as Essenes, but not in the sense as defined and described by Josephus, Philo, and Pliny. The accounts of the classical chroniclers prove to be altogether too circumscribed. They have also prevented many modern scholars from making the necessary connections, perhaps in some cases because it was not deemed desirable to do so. If the connections are made different and broader pictures emerges, a picture in which such terms as Essenes and the Qumran community will prove to be interchangeable with others. Eisenman effectively summarizes the situation. Unfortunately, for the premises of modern scholarship, terms like Ibyonim, Nazrim, Hasidim, Zedekim turn out to be variations on the same theme. The inability to relate to changeable metaphor has been a distinct failure in criticism. This precisely is what we are dealing with. Changeable metaphors, a variant of different designations used to denote the same people or factions. Recognition of that point was urged as early as 1969 by an acknowledged expert in the field, Professor Matthew Black of St. Andrews University, Scotland. The term Essene was acceptable, Professor Black wrote, provided we do not define Eisenman too narrowly, provided we do not define Essenism too narrowly, for instance, by equating it exclusively with the Dead Sea group, but are prepared to understand the term as a general description of the widespread movement of anti-Jerusalem, anti-Pharisaic nonconformity of the period. It is from such an Essene type of Judaism that Christianity is descended. There is support for Professor Black's contention in the work of Epiphanius, the early Christian writer who spoke of the Essenes. Epiphanius states that the original Christians in Judea, generally called Nazareans, as in the Acts of the Apostles, in brackets, were known as Jesseans. These Christians, or Jesseans, would have conformed precisely to Professor Black's phraseology, a widespread movement of anti-Jerusalem, anti-Pharisaic nonconformity, but there is an even more crucial connection. Among the terms by which the Qumran community referred to themselves was keepers of the covenant, which appears in the original Hebrew as Nozrei Habrit. From the term derives the word Nozarim, one of the earliest Hebrew designations for the sect subsequently known as Christians. The modern Arabic word for Christians, Nazrani, derives from the same source. So too does the word Nazorian or Nazarene, which of course was the name by which the early Christians referred to themselves in both the Gospels and the Acts of the Apostles. Contrary to the assumptions of later tradition, it has nothing whatever to do with Jesus' alleged upbringing in Nazareth, which the evidence, or lack of it, in brackets, suggests did not even exist at the time. Indeed, it seems to have been the very perplexity of early commentators encountering the unfamiliar term Nazarene that led them to conclude Jesus' family came from Nazareth, which by then had appeared on the map. To sum up, then, the Essenes who figure in classical texts, the Essenes mentioned by Epiphanius, and the Osim, the Qumran community, are one and the same. So too are the Jesseans, as Epiphanius calls the early Christians. So too are the Nazroi Habrit, the Nozrim, the Nazrani, and the Nazarenes. On the basis of the etymology, it becomes clear that we are indeed dealing with Professor Black's widespread movement, characterized, as Eisenman says, by shifting metaphor, a variety of slightly different designations used for the same people, shifting with time, translation, and transliteration, just as Caesar evolves into Kaiser and Czar. It would thus seem that the Qumran community was equivalent to the early church based in Jerusalem, the Nazarenes, or followed James, the Lord's brother. Indeed, the Habakkuk commentary states explicitly that Qumran's ruling body, the council of the community, was actually located at the time in Jerusalem, and in Acts 9:2, the members of the early church are specifically referred to as followers of the way, a phrase identical with Qumran usage. Chapter 12. The Acts of the Apostles. Apart from the Gospels themselves, the most important book of the New Testament is the Acts of the Apostles. For the historian, in fact, Acts may be of even greater consequence. Like all historical documents issuing from the partisan source, it must, of course, be handled skeptically and with caution. One must also be cognizant of whom the text was written for, and whom it might have served, as well as what end. But it is Acts, much more than the Gospels, which has hitherto constituted the apparently definitive account of the first years of early Christianity. Certainly, Acts would appear to contain much basic information not readily to be found elsewhere. To that extent alone, it is a seminal text. The Gospels, it is generally acknowledged, are unreliable as historical documents. Mark's, the first of them, was composed no earlier than the revolt of AD 66, and probably somewhat later. All four Gospels seek to evoke a period long predating their own composition, perhaps by as much as 60 or 70 years. They skim cursorily over the historical backdrop, focusing essentially on the heavily mythologized figure of Jesus and on his teachings. They are ultimately poetic and devotional texts, and do not even purport to be chronicles. Acts is a work of a very different order. It cannot, of course, be taken as absolutely historical. It is, for one thing, heavily biased. Luke, the author of the text, was clearly drawing on a number of different sources, editing and reworking material to suit his own purposes. There has been little attempt to unify either doctrinal statements or literary style. Even church historians admit that the chronology is confused, the author having had no direct experience of many of the events he describes and being obliged to impose his own order upon them. Thus, certain separate events are fused into a single occurrence, while single occurrences are made to appear to be separate events. Such problems are particularly acute in those portions of the text pertaining to events that predate the advent of Paul. Further, it would appear that Acts, like the Gospels, was compiled selectively and was extensively tampered with by latter editors. Nevertheless, Acts, unlike the Gospels, aspires to be a form of chronicle over a continuous and extended period of time. Unlike the Gospels, it constitutes an attempt to preserve an historical record, and at least in certain passages to have been written by someone with a first or second-hand experience of the events it describes. Although there is bias, the bias is highly a personal one, and this, to some extent, enables the modern commentator to read between the lines. The narrative recounted in Acts begins shortly after the crucifixion, generally dated at AD 30, but possibly as late as AD 36, and ends somewhere between AD 64 and 67. Most scholars believe the narrative itself was composed or transcribed sometime between AD 70 and 95. Roughly speaking, then, Acts is contemporary with some of, if not all, of the Gospels. It may predate all four. It almost certainly predates the so-called Gospel of John, at least in the form that the texts have come down to us. The author of Acts is a well-educated Greek who identifies himself as Luke. Whether he is the same as Luke, the beloved physician, mentioned as Paul's close friend in Colossians 4:14, cannot be definitively established, though most New Testament scholars are prepared to accept that he is. Modern scholars also concur that he would seem quite clearly to be identical with the author of Luke's Gospel. Indeed, Acts is sometimes regarded as the second half of Luke's Gospel. Both are addressed to the unknown recipient named Theophilus. Because both were written in Greek, many words and names have been translated into that language and have probably, in a number of instances, altered in nuance, even in meaning, from their Hebrew or Aramaic originals. In any case, both Acts and Luke's Gospel were written specifically for a Greek audience, a very different audience from that addressed by the Qumran scrolls. Although focusing primarily on Paul, who monopolizes the latter part of its narrative, Acts also tells the story of Paul's relations with the community in Jerusalem, composed of Jesus' immediate disciples under the leadership of James, the Lord's brother, the enclave or faction who only later came to be called the first Christians and are now regarded as the early or original church. In recounting Paul's association with this community, however, Acts offers only Paul's point of view. Acts is essentially a document of Pauline, or what is now deemed to be normative Christianity. Paul, in other words, is always the hero, whoever opposes him, whether it be the authorities or even James, is automatically cast as villain. Acts opens shortly after Jesus, referred to as the Nazarene, in Greek Nazoraean, in brackets, has disappeared from the scene. The narrative then proceeds to describe the organization and development of the community or early church in Jerusalem and its increasing friction with the authorities. The community is vividly evoked in Acts 2:44 to 2:46. Yes, 2:44 to 2:46. The faithful all lived together and owned everything in common. They sold their goods and possessions and shared out the proceeds among themselves according to what each one needed. They went as a body to the temple every day, but met in their houses for the breaking of bread. It is worth noting in passing this adherence to the temple. Jesus and his immediate followers are usually portrayed as hostile to the temple, where, according to the Gospels, Jesus upset the tables of the money changers and incurred the passionate displeasure of the priesthood. Acts 6:8 introduces the figure known as Stephen, the first official Christian martyr, who is arrested and sentenced to death by stoning. In his own defense, Stephen alludes to the murder of those who prophesied the advent of the righteous one or the just one. This terminology is specifically and uniquely Qumranic in character. The righteous one occurs repeatedly in the Dead Sea Scrolls as Zadik, the teacher of righteousness. In the scrolls, More HaZedek derives from the same root. And when the historian Josephus speaks of a teacher apparently named Zadok or Zadok, as the leader of a messianic and anti-Roman Judaic following. This, too, would seem to be a faulty Greek rendering of the righteous one. As portrayed in Acts, then, Stephen uses nomenclature unique and specifically characteristic of Qumran. Nor is this the only Qumranic concern to figure in Stephen's speech. In his defense, he names his persecutors in Acts 7:53 in brackets. You who had the law brought to you by angels are the very ones who have not kept it. As Acts portrays it, Stephen is obviously intent on adherence to the law. Again, there is a conflict here with orthodox and accepted traditions. According to latter Christian tradition, it was the Jews of the time who made an austere and puritanical fetish of the law. The early Christians are depicted, at least from the standpoint of that stringency, as mavericks or renegades, advocating a new freedom and flexibility, defying custom and convention. Yet it is Stephen, the first Christian martyr, who emerges as an advocate of the law, while his persecutors are accused of dereliction. It makes no sense for Stephen, a self-proclaimed adherent of the law, to be murdered by fellow Jews, extolling the same law. But what if those fellow Jews were acting on behalf of a priesthood which had come to an accommodation with the Roman authorities, were in effect collaborators who, like many of the French under the German occupation, for example, simply wanted a quiet life and feared an agitator or resistance fighter in their midst might lead to reprisals? The early church, of which Stephen is a member, constantly stresses its own orthodoxy, its zealous adherence to the law. Its persecutors are those who contrive to remain in good order with Rome, and in doing so lapse from the law, or in Qumran terms, transgress the law, betray the law. In this context, Stephen's denunciation of them makes sense, as does the murder of him. And as we shall see, James the Just, the Zadok or righteous one, the brother of the Lord, who best exemplifies rigorous adherence to the law, will subsequently, according to later tradition, suffer precisely the same fate as Stephen. According to Acts, it is at the death of Stephen that Paul, then called Saul of Tarsus, makes his debut. He is said to have stood watch over the discarded clothes of Stephen's murderers, though he may well have taken a more active role. In Acts 8:1, we are told that Saul entirely approved of the killing of Stephen. And later, in Acts 9:21, Saul is accused of engineering precisely the kind of attack on the early church which culminated in Stephen's death. Certainly Saul, at the stage of his life, is fervent, even fanatic, in his enmity towards the early church. According to Acts 8:3, he worked for the total destruction of the church. He went from house to house, arresting both men and women and sending them to prison. At the time, of course, he is acting as a minion of the pro-Roman priesthood. Acts 9 tells us of Saul's conversion. Shortly after Stephen's death, he embarks for Damascus to ferret out members of the early church there. He is accompanied by his hit squad and bears arrest warrants from his master, the high priest. As we have noted, this expedition is likely to have been not to Syria, but to the Damascus that figures in the Damascus document. En route to his destination, Saul undergoes some sort of traumatic experience, which commentators have interpreted as anything from sunstroke to an epileptic seizure to a mystical revelation. Acts 9:1 to 19, 22, 6 to 16. A light from heaven purportedly knocks him from his horse, and a voice, issuing from no perceivable source, demands of him, "Saul, "Saul, why are you persecuting me?" Saul asked the voice to identify itself. "I am Jesus, the Nazarene," the voice replies, "and you are persecuting me." The voice further instructs him to proceed to Damascus, where he will learn what he must subsequently do. When this visitation passes and Saul regains a semblance of his former consciousness, he finds he has been stricken temporarily blind. In Damascus, his sight will be restored by a member of the early church, and he will allow himself to be baptized. A modern psychologist would find nothing particularly unusual in Saul's adventure. It may indeed have been produced by sunstroke or an epileptic seizure. It could equally well be ascribed to hallucination, hysterical or psychotic reaction, or perhaps nothing more than the guilty conscience of a susceptible man with blood on his hands. Saul, however, interprets it as a true manifestation of Jesus, whom he never knew personally, and from his conversion ensues. He abandons his former name in favor of Paul, and he will subsequently be a fervent in promulgating the teachings of the early church, as he has hitherto been in extirpating them. He joins their community, becomes one of their apprentices or disciples, according to his letter to the Galatians, Galatians 1:17-18. He remains under their tutelage for 3 years, spending much of that time in Damascus. According to the Dead Sea Scrolls, the probation and training period for a newcomer to Qumran community was also 3 years. After his 3-year apprenticeship, Paul returns to Jerusalem to join the leaders of the community there. Not surprisingly, most of them are suspicious of him, not being wholly convinced by his conversion. In Galatians 1:18-20, he speaks of seeing only James and Cephas. Everyone else, including the apostles, seems to have avoided him. He is obliged repeatedly to prove himself, and only then does he find some allies and begin to preach. Arguments ensue, however, and according to Acts 9:29, certain members of the Jerusalem community threaten him. As a means of diffusing a potentially ugly situation, his allies pack him off to Tarsus, the town, now in Turkey, in brackets, where he was born. He is, in effect, being sent home to spread the message there. It is important to understand that this was a tantamount to exile. The community in Jerusalem, like that in Qumran, was preoccupied almost entirely with events in Palestine. The wider world, such as Rome, was relevant only to the extent that it impinged or encroached on their more localized reality. To send Paul off to Tarsus, therefore, might be compared to a provisional IRA godfather sending a new ill-disciplined and overly energetic recruit to muster support among the Shining Path guerrillas of Peru. If by improbable fluke he somehow elicits men, money, material, or anything else of value, well and good. If he gets himself disemboweled instead, he will not be unduly missed, having been more nuisance than asset anyway. Thus arises the first of Paul's 3, according to the Acts, in brackets, sorties abroad. Among other places, it takes him to Antioch, and as we learn from Acts 11:26, it was at Antioch that the disciples were first called Christians. Commentators date Paul's journey to Antioch at approximately AD 43. By that time, a community of the early church was already established there, which reported back to the sect's leadership in Jerusalem under James. Some 5 or more years later, Paul is teaching in Antioch when a dispute arises over the content of a missionary work. As Acts 15 explains, certain representatives of the leadership in Jerusalem arrive in Antioch, perhaps Eisenman suggests, with the specific purpose of checking on Paul's activities. They stress the importance of strict adherence to the law and accuse Paul of laxity. He and his companion Barnabas are summarily ordered back to Jerusalem for personal consultation with the leadership. From this point on, a schism will open and widen between Paul and James, and the author of Acts, so far as the dispute is concerned, becomes Paul's apologist. In all the vicissitudes that follow, it must be emphasized that Paul is, in effect, the first Christian heretic, and that his teachings, which become the foundation of later Christianity, are a flagrant deviation from the original or a pure form extolled by the leadership. Whether James, the Lord's brother, was literally Jesus' blood kin or not, and everything suggests he was, in brackets, it is clear that he knew Jesus or the figure subsequently remembered as Jesus personally. So did most of the other members of the community or early church in Jerusalem, including, of course, Peter. When they spoke, they did so with first-hand authority. Paul had never had such personal acquaintance with the figure he'd begun to regard as his Savior. He had only his quasi-mystical experience in the desert and the sound of a disembodied voice. For him to arrogate authority to himself on this basis is, to say the least, presumptuous. It also leads him to distort Jesus' teachings beyond all recognition, to formulate, in fact, his own highly individual and idiosyncratic theology, and then to legitimize it by spuriously ascribing it to Jesus. So again, the point driven home. For him to arrogate authority to himself on this basis is, to say the least, presumptuous. It also leads him to distort Jesus' teachings beyond all recognition, to formulate, in fact, his own highly individual and idiosyncratic theology, and then to legitimize it by spuriously ascribing it to Jesus. For Jesus adhering rigorously to Judaic law, it would have been the most extreme blasphemy to advocate worship of any mortal figure, including himself. He makes this clear in the Gospels, urging his disciples, followers, and listeners to acknowledge only God. In John 10:33 to 10:35, for example, Jesus is accused of the blasphemy of claiming to be God. He replies, citing Psalm 82, "Is it not written in your law, I," meaning God in the psalm, "said you are gods?" So the law uses the words gods for those to whom the word of God was addressed. Paul, in effect, shunts God aside and establishes for the first time worship of Jesus as a kind of equivalent of Adonis, of Tammuz, of Attis, or of any one of the other dying and reviving gods who populated the Middle East at the time. In order to compete with these divine rivals, Jesus had to match them point for point, miracle for miracle. It is at this stage that many of the miraculous elements became associated with Jesus' biography, including, in all probability, his supposed birth of a virgin and his resurrection from the dead. They are essentially Pauline inventions, often wildly at odds with the pure doctrine promulgated by James and the rest of the community in Jerusalem. It is hardly surprising, therefore, that James and his entourage should be disturbed by what Paul is doing. Yet Paul knows full well what he is doing. He understands with a surprisingly modern sophistication the techniques of religious propaganda. He understands what is necessary to turn a man into a god, and he goes about it more astutely than the Romans did with their emperors. As he himself pointedly acknowledges, He does not pretend to be purveying the historical Jesus, the individual whom Peter and James and Simeon knew personally. On the contrary, he acknowledges in 2 Corinthians 11, 3-4, that the community in Jerusalem are promulgating another Jesus. Their representatives, he says, calls themselves servants of righteousness, a characteristic Qumranic usage. They are now, in all intents and purposes, Paul's adversaries. In accordance with instructions issued to him, Paul returns from Antioch to Jerusalem around 48-49, it is generally believed, and meets with the community's leadership. Not surprisingly, another dispute ensues. If Acts is to be believed, James, for the sake of peace, agrees to compromise, thereby making it easier for pagans to join the congregation. Somewhat improbably, he consents to relax certain aspects of the law while remaining adamant on others. Paul pays lip service to the leadership. He still, at this point, needs their endorsement, not to legitimize his teachings, but to legitimize and ensure the survival of the communities he has founded abroad. He is already, however, bent on going his own way. He embarks on another mission of travel and preaching, punctuated, Acts 18:21 in brackets, by another visit to Jerusalem. Most of his letters date from this period between AD 50 and 58. It is clear from his letters that he has, by that time, become almost completely estranged from the leadership in Jerusalem and from their adherence to the law. In his missive to the Galatians, AD 57, he alludes scathingly to these people who are acknowledged leaders, not that their importance matters to me. Galatians 2:6 in brackets. His theological position has also deviated irreparably from those who adhere rigorously to the law. In the same letter to the Galatians 2:16, he states that faith in Christ, rather than fidelity to the law, is what justifies us, and no one can be justified by keeping the law. Writing to the Philippians 3:9, in brackets, he states, I am no longer trying for perfection by my own efforts, the perfection that comes from the law. These are the provocative and challenging statements of a self-proclaimed renegade. Christianity, as it will subsequently evolve from Paul, has by now severed virtually all connection to its roots and can no longer be said to have anything to do with Jesus, only with Paul's image of Jesus. By AD 58, Paul is again back in Jerusalem, despite pleas from his supporters, who obviously, fearing trouble with the hierarchy, have begged him not to go. Again he meets with James and the leadership of the Jerusalem community. Employing the now familiar Qumranic formulation, they express the worry they share with other zealots of the law, that Paul, in his preaching to Jews living abroad, is encouraging them to forsake the law of Moses. It is, of course, a justified accusation, as Paul has made clear in his letters. Acts does not record his response to it. The impression conveyed is that he lies, perjures himself, and denies the charges against him. When asked to purify himself for 7 days, thereby demonstrating the unjustness of the allegations and his continued adherence to the law, he readily consents to do so. A few days later, however, he again runs foul of those zealous for the law, who are rather less temperate than James. On being seen at the temple, he is attacked by a crowd of the pious. This, they claim, in their anger, is the man who preaches to everyone, everywhere, against the law. Acts 21:28 ff. A riot ensues, and Paul is dragged out of the temple, his life in danger. In the nick of time, he is rescued by a Roman officer who, having been told of the disturbance, appears with an entourage of soldiers. Paul is arrested and put in chains, on the initial assumption apparently that he is a leader of the Sicarii, the zealot terrorist cadre. At this point, the narrative becomes increasingly confused, and one can only suspect that parts of it have been altered or expurgated. According to the existing text, Paul, before the Romans can trundle him off, protests that he is a Jew of Tarsus and asks permission to address the crowd who has just been trying to lynch him. Weirdly enough, the Romans allow him to do so. Paul then expatiates on his Pharisaic training under Gamaliel, a former teacher of the time, in brackets, on the initial hostility towards the early church, on his role in the death of Stephen, on his subsequent conversion. All of this, or perhaps only a part of it, though one cannot be certain which part, provokes the crowd to new ire. "Rid the earth of this man," they cry. "He is not fit to live." Acts 22:22. Ignoring these appeals, the Romans carry Paul off to the fortress, presumably the Antonia fortress. The Antonia fortress, the Roman military and administrative headquarters. Here, they intend to interrogate him under torture. Interrogate him for what? To determine why he provokes such hostility according to Acts? Yet Paul has already made his position clear in public, unless there are elements of his speech that, in a fashion not made clear by the text, the Romans deem dangerous or subversive. In any case, torture by Roman law could not be exercised on any individual possessing full and official Roman citizenship, which Paul, having been born of a wealthy family in Tarsus, conveniently does. Invoking this immunity, he escapes torture, but remains incarcerated. In the meantime, a group of angry Jews, 40 or more in number, meet in secret. They vow not to eat or drink until they have brought about Paul's death. The sheer intensity and ferocity of this antipathy is worth noting. One does not expect such animosity, not to say such a preparedness for violence, from ordinary Pharisees and Sadducees. Those who display it are obviously zealots for the law. But the only such passionate adherents of the law in Palestine at the time were those sacred texts came subsequently to light at Qumran. Thus, for example, Eisenman calls attention to the pivotal passage in the Damascus document which declares of a man that if he transgresses, after swearing to return to the law of Moses with a whole heart and soul, then retribution shall be exacted from him. How can the violent action contemplated against Paul be reconciled with the latter popular image put forward by the consensus of placid, aesthetic, quietist Essenes? The clandestine conclave, the fervent vow to eradicate Paul, these are more characteristic of the militant zealots and their special assassination units, the dreaded Sicarii. Here again, there is an insistent suggestion that the zealots on the one hand and the zealous for the law at Qumran on the other were one and the same. Whoever they are, the would-be assassins, according to Acts, are thwarted by the sudden and opportune appearance of Paul's hitherto unmentioned nephew, who somehow learns of their plot. This relative, of whom we know nothing more, informs both Paul and the Romans. That night Paul is removed for his own safety from Jerusalem. He is removed with an escort of 470 troops, 200 infantry under the command of 2 centurions, 200 spearmen, and 70 cavalry. He is taken to Caesarea, the Roman capital of Judea, where he appears before the governor and Rome's puppet king. Agrippa. He is taken to Caesarea, the Roman capital of Judea, where he appears before the governor and Rome's puppet king, Agrippa. As a Roman citizen, However, Paul has the right to have his case heard in Rome, and he invokes this right. As a result, he is sent to Rome, ostensibly for trial. There is no indication of what he will be tried for. After recounting his adventures on the journey, including a shipwreck, Acts ends. Or rather, it breaks off, as if the author were interrupted in his work, or as if someone had removed the original ending and inserted a perfunctory finale instead. Or rather, it breaks off as if the author were interrupted. Oh, for crying out loud. Wow. One more time. Or rather, it breaks off as if the author were interrupted in his work, or as if someone had removed the original ending and inserted a perfunctory finale instead. There are, of course, numerous later traditions that Paul was imprisoned, that he obtained a personal audience with the emperor, and that he was freed and went to Spain, that Nero ordered his execution, that he encountered Peter in Rome, or in person in Rome, in brackets, that he and Peter were executed together. But neither in Acts nor in any other reliable document is there a basis for any of these stories. Perhaps the original ending of Acts was indeed excised or altered. Perhaps Luke, the author, simply did not know what happened next, and not being concerned with aesthetic symmetry, simply allowed himself to conclude lamely. Or perhaps, as Eisenman has suggested, and this possibly will be considered later, Luke did know, but deliberately cut short his narrative, or was cut short by later editors, in order to conceal his knowledge. The last sections of Acts, from the riot inspired in the temple on, are muddled, confused, and riddled with unanswered questions. Elsewhere, however, Acts is ostensibly simple enough. On one level, there is the narrative of Paul's conversion and subsequent adventures. But behind this account looms a chronicle of increasing friction between two factions within the original community in Jerusalem, the early church. One of these factions consists of hardliners who echo the teachings of Qumranic texts and insist on rigorous observance of the law. The other, exemplified by Paul and his immediate supporters, want to relax the law, and by making it easier for people to join the congregation, to increase the number of new recruits. The hardliners are less concerned with numbers than with doctrinal purity, and seem to have only a cursory interest in events or developments outside Palestine, nor do they display any desire for an accommodation with Rome. Paul, on the other hand, is prepared to dispense with doctrinal purity. His primary objective is to disseminate his message as widely as possible and to assemble the largest possible body of adherents. In order to attain this objective, he goes out of his way to avoid antagonizing the authorities and is perfectly willing to come to an accommodation with Rome, even to curry favor. The early church, then, as it appears in Acts, is rent by incipient schism. The early church, then, as it appears in Acts, is rent by incipient schism, the instigator of which is Paul. Paul's chief adversary is the enigmatic figure of James, the Lord's brother. It is clear that James is the acknowledged leader of the community in Jerusalem that becomes known to latter tradition as the early church. For the most part, James comes across as a hardliner, though he does, if Acts is to be believed, display a willingness to compromise on certain points. All the evidence suggests, however, that even the modest flexibility reflects some license on the part of the author of Acts. James could not obviously have been excised from the narrative. His role, presumably, would have been too well known. In consequence, he could only be played down somewhat and portrayed as a conciliatory figure, a figure occupying a position somewhere between Paul and the extreme hardliners. In any case, the subtext of Acts reduces itself to a clash between two powerful personalities, James and Paul. Eisenman has demonstrated that James emerges as the custodian of the original body of teachings, the exponent of doctrinal purity and rigorous adherence to the law. The last thing he would have had in mind was founding a new religion. Paul is doing precisely that. Paul's Jesus is a full-fledged God whose biography, miracle for miracle, comes to match those of the rival deities with whom he is competing for devotees. One sells gods, after all, on the same marketing principles that obtain for soap or pet food. By James's standards, indeed by the standards of any devout Jew, this, of course, is blasphemy and apostasy. Given the passions roused by such issues, the rift between James and Paul would hardly have been confined, as Acts suggests it was, to the level of civilized debate. It would have generated the kind of murderous hostility that surfaces at the end of the narrative. In the conflict between James and Paul, the emergence and evolution of what we call Christianity stood at the crossroads. Had the mainstream of its development conformed to James's teachings, there would have been no Christianity at all, only a particular species of Judaism which might or might not have emerged as dominant. As things transpired, however, the mainstream of the new movement gradually coalesced during the next 3 centuries around Paul and his teachings. Thus, to the undoubted posthumous horror of James and his associates, an entirely new religion was indeed born, a religion which came to have less and less to do with its supposed founder. (13) James the Righteous. If James played so important a role in the events of the time, why do we know so little about him? Why has he been relegated to the status of a shadowy figure in the background? Those questions can be answered simply enough. Eisenman stresses that James, whether he was literally Jesus' brother or not, had known Jesus personally in a way that Paul never did. In his teachings, he was certainly closer to the source than Paul ever was, and his objectives and preoccupations were often at variance with Paul's, were sometimes indeed diametrically opposed. For Paul, then James would have been a constant irritant. With the triumph of Pauline Christianity, therefore, James' significance, if it couldn't be obliterated completely, had at the very least to be diminished. Unlike a number of personalities in the New Testament, James does seem to have been an historical personage, and moreover, one who played a more prominent role in the affairs of his time than is generally recognized. There is, in fact, a reasonably copious body of literature pertaining to James, even though most of it lies outside the canonical compilation of the New Testament. In the New Testament itself, James is mentioned in the Gospels as one of Jesus' brothers, though the context is generally vague or confusing and has obviously been tampered with. In Acts, as we have discussed, he assumes rather more prominence, though it is not until the second part of Acts that he emerges in a kind of perspective. Then, with Paul's letter to the Galatians, he is clearly identified as the leader of the early church, who resides in Jerusalem and is attended by a council of elders. Apart from those that impinge on Paul, however, one learns little of his activities and even less about his personality and biography. Neither is the letter of James in the New Testament of much value in this respect. The letter may indeed derive from a text by James, and Eisenman has drawn attention to its Qumranic style, language, and imagery. It contains James 5:6 in brackets, an accusation whose significance will become apparent shortly. An accusation to the effect that you murdered the righteous, in square brackets, or just man. Again, however, no personal information is vouchsafed. Such is James's role in Scripture proper. But if one looks farther afield, a portrait of James does begin to emerge. This is the research which Eisenman has been pursuing over the last few years. One source of information he has emphasized is an anonymous text of the early church, the so-called Recognitions of Clement, which surfaced very early in the 3rd century. According to this document, James is preaching in the temple when an unnamed enemy, accompanied by an entourage of followers, burst in. The enemy taunts James's listeners and drowns out his words with noise, then proceeds to inflame the crowd with revelings and abuse, and like a madman, to excite everyone to murder, saying, "What do ye? Why do ye hesitate? O sluggish and inert, why do we not lay hands upon them and put all these fellows to pieces?" The enemy does not confine himself to a verbal assault. Seizing a brand of wood, he begins to flail about with it at the assembled worshippers, and his entourage follows suit. A full-scale riot ensues. Much blood is shed. There is a confused flight, in the midst of which that enemy attacked James and threw him headlong from the top of the steps, and supposing him to be dead, he cared not to inflict further violence upon him. That's the quote. James, however, is not dead. According to the Recognitions, his supporters carry him back to his house in Jerusalem. The next morning, before dawn, the injured man and his supporters flee the city, making their way to Jericho, where they remained for some time, presumably while James convalescens. For Eisenman, this attack on James is pivotal. He notes the parallels between it and the attack on Stephen, as recounted in Acts. He suggests that Stephen may be an inventive figure to disguise the fact that the attack, as Acts could not possibly have admitted, was really directed at James. And he points out that Jericho, where James flees for refuge, is only a few miles from Qumran. What is more, he argues, the flight of Jericho has a ring of historical truth to it. It is the kind of incidental detail that is unlikely to have been fabricated and interpolated, because it serves no particular purpose. As for the enemy, there would seem to be little doubt about his identity. The Recognitions of Clement concludes, here's the quote, "Then after 3 days one of the brethren came to us from Gamaliel, bringing the secret tidings that the enemy had received a commission from Caiaphas, the chief priest, and that he should arrest all who believed in Jesus and go to Damascus with his letters." End of the quote. The surviving editions of Josephus's Antiquities of the Jews contain only one reference to James, which may or may not be later interpolation. The Chronicle reports that the Sanhedrin, the religious high court, called before them James, the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, accused, most improbably, of breaking the law. James and certain of his companions are found guilty and accordingly stoned to death. Whether this account is accurate, doctored, or wholly invented, the most important aspect of it is the date to which it refers. Josephus indicates that the events he has described occurred during an interval between Roman procurators in Judea. The incumbent procurator had just died. His successor, Lucius Albinus, was still en route to Palestine from Rome. During the interregnum, effective power in Jerusalem was wielded by the high priest, an unpopular man named Ananus. This allows the account of James' death to be dated at around AD 62, only 4 years before the outbreak of the revolt in AD 66. Here, then, is at least some chronological evidence that James's death may have had something to do with the war that ravaged the Holy Land between AD 66 and 73. For further information, however, one must turn to later church historians. Perhaps the major source is Eusebius, 4th century bishop of Caesarea, the Roman capital of Judea, in brackets, the author of one of the most important early church histories. In accordance with the conventions of the time, Eusebius quotes at length from earlier writers, many of whose works have not survived. In speaking of James, he cites Clement, Bishop of Alexandria, AD 150 to 215. Clement refers to James, we are told, as the righteous, or as it is often translated, the just, Zadok in Hebrew. This, of course, is the by now familiar Qumranic usage, whence derives the teacher of righteousness, the leader of the Qumran community. According to Clement, Eusebius reports James was thrown from a parapet of the temple, then beaten to death with a club. Later in his chronicle, Eusebius quotes extensively from 2nd century church historian Hegesippus. All of Hegesippus's works were reputedly extant as late as the 16th or 17th century. Everything has since disappeared, though copies may well exist in the Vatican, as well as in the library of one or another monastery. In Spain, for example. At present, however, almost everything we have by Hegesippus is contained in the excerpts from his work cited by Eusebius. Quoting Hegesippus, Eusebius states that James the righteous was holy from his birth. He drank no wine, ate no animal food, no razor came near his head. He did not smear himself with oil, and took no baths. He alone was permitted to enter the holy place, the Holy of Holies in the temple. For his garments were not of wool, but of linen, i.e., priestly robes, in square brackets. He used to enter the sanctuary alone, and was often found on his knees beseeching forgiveness for the people, so that his knees grew hard like a camel's, because of his unsurpassable righteousness. He was called the righteous and bulwark of the people. End of the quote. At this point, it is worth interrupting the text to note certain intriguing details. James is said to wear linen or priestly robes. This was the prerogative of those who served in the temple and belonged to one of the priestly families, traditionally the Sadducean aristocracy, who during the 1st century came to an accommodation with Rome and the Herodian dynasty of Roman puppets. Again, Eisenman points out Epiphanius, another church historian, speaks of James wearing the mitre of the high priest. Then, too, only the high priest was allowed to enter the Holy of Holies, the inner sanctum, the most sacred spot in the temple. What then can James be doing there? And without eliciting any explanation or expression of surprise from church historians, who seem to find nothing untoward or irregular in his activities? Did he perhaps, by virtue of his birth, have some legitimate right to wear priestly apparel and enter the Holy of Holies? Or might he have been acting, as Eisenman suggests, in the capacity of a kind of opposition high priest, a rebel who, defying the established priesthood's accommodation with Rome, had taken upon himself the role that they had betrayed? Certainly the established priesthood had no affection for James. According to Hegesippus, the scribes and Pharisees decide to do away with him, so that the people will be frightened and not believe him. They proclaim that even the righteous one has gone astray, and invoke a quote from the Old Testament, in this case from the prophet Isaiah. Isaiah 3:10 in brackets, to justify their actions. They note that Isaiah had prophesied the death of the righteous one. In murdering James, they will simply be bringing Isaiah's prophecy to fulfillment. But also, in using this quote from Isaiah, they are following a technique employed in both the Dead Sea Scrolls and the New Testament. Eisenman points out that just as this quote is used in order to describe the death of James, so the Qumran community employs similar righteousness passages from the New Testament in order to describe the death of the teacher of righteousness. Eusebius goes on to describe the death of James in the following manner. Here's the quote. So they went up and threw down the righteous one. They said to each other, "Let us stone James the righteous," and began to stone him, as in spite of his fall he was still alive. While they pelted him with stones, a member of a particular priestly family called out, "Stop! What are you doing?" Then one of them, a fuller, took the club which was used to beat clothes and brought it down on the head of the righteous one. Such was the martyrdom. Immediately after this, Vespasian began to besiege them. Vespasian, who became emperor in AD 69, commanded the Roman army that invaded Judea to put down the revolt of AD 66. Here again, then, is a chronological connection between James's death and the revolt. But Eusebius goes farther. The connection for him is more than just chronological. The entire siege of Jerusalem, he says, meaning presumably the whole of the revolt in Judea, was a direct consequence of James's death, for no other reason than the wicked crime of which he had been the victim. To support this startling contention, Eusebius invokes Josephus. The passage of Josephus he quotes, although no longer to be found in any extant version of Josephus, was unquestionably what Josephus wrote, because Origen, one of the earliest and most prolific of the Church Fathers, quotes precisely the same passage. Referring to the revolt of AD 66 and the Roman invasion that followed, Josephus states that these things happened to the Jews in requital for James the righteous, who was the brother of Jesus known as Christ. For though he was the most righteous of men, the Jews put him to death. From these fragments pertaining to James, a scenario begins to take form. James, the acknowledged leader of the early church in Jerusalem, represents a faction of Jews who, like the Qumran community, are zealous for the law. This faction is understandably hostile towards the Sadducee priesthood and the high priest Ananus, appointed by Herod, in brackets, who have betrayed their nation and their religion by concluding an accord with the Roman administration and its Herodian puppet kings. So intense is this hostility that James arrogates to himself the priestly functions which Ananus has compromised. Ananus' supporters respond by contriving James' death. Almost immediately thereafter, the whole of Judea rises in revolt, and Ananus is himself one of the first casualties, assassinated as a pro-Roman collaborator. As the rebellion gains momentum, Rome is forced to react, and does so by dispatching an expeditionary force under Vespasian. The result is the war which witnesses the sack of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple in AD 68, and which does not end until the fall of Masada in AD 74. Excuse me, but it's always been my understanding that the sack of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple was in 70 AD. I've never heard it expressed as being in 68. If anyone else has, leave it in the comments. The only uncertain element in this scenario is the nature and magnitude of the part played by James's death. Did it merely coincide chronologically? Or was it, as Josephus and Eusebius assert, the primary causal factor? The truth almost certainly lies somewhere in between. The revolt stemmed from enough contributing factors for the historian not to have had a fallback on James's death as a sole explanation. On the other hand, the evidence unquestionably indicates that James's death was not just a marginal incident. It would seem to have had at least something to do with the course of public events. In any case, James, as a result of Wiseman's analysis, indubitably emerges as a more important personage in first-century history than Christian tradition has hitherto acknowledged. And the early church emerges in a very different light. It is no longer a congregation of devotees, eschewing politics and public affairs, pursuing a course of personal salvation and aspiring to no kingdom other than that of heaven. On the contrary, it becomes one of the manifestations of Judaic nationalism at that time, a body of militant individuals intent on upholding the law, deposing the corrupt Sadducee priesthood of the temple, toppling the dynasty of illegitimate puppet kings, and driving the occupying Romans from the Holy Land. In all these respects, it conforms to conventional images of the Zealots. But what has all this to do with Qumran and the Dead Sea Scrolls? From the Acts of the Apostles, from Josephus and the early Christian historians, there emerges a coherent, if still incomplete, portrait of James, the Lord's brother. He appears as an exemplar of righteousness, so much that the just or the righteous is appended as a sobriquet to his name. He is the acknowledged leader of the sectarian religious community, whose members are zealous for the law. He must contend with two quite separate and distinct adversaries. One of these is Paul, an outsider who, having first persecuted the community, then converts and is admitted into it, only to turn renegade, prevaricate, and quarrel with his superiors, hijack the image of Jesus, and begin preaching his own doctrine, a doctrine which draws on that of the community but distorts it. James's second adversary is from outside the community, the high priest Ananus, head of the Sadducee priesthood. Ananus is a notoriously corrupt and widely hated man. He has also betrayed both the God and the people of Israel by collaborating with the Roman administration and their Herodian puppet kings. James publicly challenges Ananus and eventually meets his death at the hands of Ananus's minions, but Ananus will shortly be assassinated in turn. All of this takes place against a backdrop of increasing social and political unrest and the impending invasion of a foreign army. With this scenario in mind, Wiseman turned to the Dead Sea Scrolls, and particularly the Habakkuk commentary. When the fragmentary details of the Qumran text had been assembled into a coherent sequence, what emerged was something extraordinarily similar to the Chronicle of Acts, Josephus, and early Christian historians. The scrolls told their own story, at the center of which was a single protagonist, the teacher of righteousness, an exemplar of the same virtues associated with James. Like James, the teacher was the acknowledged leader of the sectarian religious community whose members were zealots, zealous for the law. And like James, the teacher had to contend with two quite separate and distinct adversaries. One of these was dubbed the liar, an outsider who was admitted to the community, then turned renegade, quarreled with the teacher, and hijacked part of the community's doctrine and membership. According to the Habakkuk commentary, the liar did not listen to the word received by the teacher of righteousness from the mouth of God. Instead, he appealed to the unfaithful of the new covenant, in that they have not believed in the covenant of God and have profaned his holy name. The text states explicitly that the liar flouted the law in the midst of their whole congregation. He led many astray and raised a congregation on deceit. He himself is said to be pregnant with works of deceit. These, of course, are precisely the transgressions of which Paul is accused in Acts. Transgressions which lead to the end of Acts, to the attempt on his life. And Eisenman stresses Paul's striking hypersensitivity to charges of prevarication and perjury. In 1 Timothy 2, verse 7, for example, he asserts indignantly, as if defending himself, that I am telling the truth and no lie. In 2 Corinthians 11:31, he swears that the God and Father of the Lord Jesus knows that I am not lying. These are but two instances. Paul's letters reveal an almost obsessive desire to exculpate himself from implied accusations of falsity. According to the Dead Sea Scrolls, the liar was the adversary of the teacher of righteousness from within the community. The teacher's second adversary was from outside. This was the wicked priest, a corrupt representative of the establishment who had betrayed his function and his faith. He conspired to exterminate the poor, those zealous for the law, said to be scattered about Jerusalem and other places. He harried the teacher of righteousness wherever the teacher sought refuge. At the hands of the wicked priest's minions, the teacher suffered from some serious injury, and possibly, the text is vague on the matter, death. Subsequently, the wicked priest was himself assassinated by the followers of the teacher, who, after killing him, took vengeance upon his body of flesh, that is, defiled his corpse. The parallels between the wicked priest of the scrolls and the historical figure of the high priest, Ananias, are unmistakable. In his book on James, Eisenman explores these parallels. James, Paul, and Ananias, on the one hand, the teacher of righteousness, the liar, and the wicked priest on the other. In exhaustive detail, he goes through the Habakkuk commentary and other texts line by line, comparing them with information vouchsafed by Acts, by Josephus, and by early Christian historians. In our own pages, it would be impossible to do adequate justice to the weight of evidence he amasses. But the conclusions of this evidence are inescapable. The Habakkuk commentary and certain other of the Dead Sea Scrolls are referring to the same events as those recounted in Acts, in Josephus, and in the works of early Christian historians. This conclusion is reinforced by the striking and pervasive recurrence of Qumranic philosophy and imagery in Acts, in the letter of James, and in Paul's copious epistles. It is also reinforced by the revelation that the place for which Paul embarks, and in which he spends 3 years as a postulant, is in fact Qumran, not the city in Syria. Even the one fragment that would not, at first, appear to fit the fact that the persecution and death of James occurs quite specifically in Jerusalem, while the Dead Sea Scrolls have been assumed to chronicle events in Qumran, is explained within the texts themselves. The Habakkuk commentary states explicitly that the leadership of the community were in Jerusalem at the relevant time. There is another point which Eisenman stresses as being particularly important. In the letter to the Romans, 1:17, Paul states that this is what reveals the injustice of God to us. It shows how faith leads to faith, or as Scripture says, the upright man finds life through faith. The same theme appears in the letter to the Galatians, 3:11. The law will not justify anyone in the sight of God, because we are told the righteous man finds life through faith. These two statements constitute, in effect, the starting point of the theological concept of faith. They are ultimately, as Eisenman says, the foundation piece of Pauline theology. They provide the basis on which Paul is able to make his stand against James, is able to extol the supremacy of faith, while James extols the supremacy of the law. From where does Paul derive this principle of the supremacy of faith? It was certainly not an accepted part of Judaic teaching at the time. In fact, it derives from the original book of Habakkuk, a text of Old Testament Apocrypha believed to date from the mid-7th century BC, according to chapter 2, verse 4 of the book of Habakkuk. The upright man will live by his faithfulness. Paul's words in his letters are clearly an echo of the statement, and the book of Habakkuk is clearly the scripture to which Paul refers. More important still, however, is the Habakkuk commentary, the gloss and exegesis on part of the book of Habakkuk found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Habakkuk commentary cites the same statement and then proceeds to elaborate upon it. Here is the quote. "But the righteous shall live by his faith, interpreting this concern all those who observe the law in the house of Judah, whom God will deliver from the house of judgment because of their suffering and because of their faith in the teacher of righteousness." End of quote. This extraordinary passage is tantamount, in effect, to the formulation of early Christian doctrine. It states explicitly that suffering and faith in the teacher of righteousness constitute the path to deliverance and salvation. From this passage in the Dead Sea Scrolls, Paul must have derived the foundation for the whole of his own theology. But the passage in question declares unequivocally that suffering and faith in the teacher of righteousness will lead to deliverance only among those who observe the law in the house of Judah. It is just such emphasis on adherence to the law that Paul contrives to ignore, thereby precipitating his doctrinal dispute with James and the other members of the early church. 14. Zeal for the law. According to Robert Eisenman, the Qumran community emerges from the Dead Sea Scrolls as a movement of a very different nature to that of the Essenes of popular tradition. This movement has centers not just in Qumran, but in a number of other places as well, including Jerusalem. It can exercise considerable influence, can wield considerable power, can command considerable support. It can dispatch Paul as well as many others on embassies of recruitment and fundraising abroad. It can organize riots and public disturbances. It can plot assassinations, such as that attempted on Paul at the end of Acts, and subsequently that of Ananias, in brackets. It can put forward its own legitimate alternative candidate for the position of the temple's high priest. It can capture and hold strategically important fortresses such as Masada. Most significantly of all, it can galvanize the entire population of Judea around it and instigate a full-fledged revolt against Rome. A revolt which leads to a major conflict of 7 years' duration and necessitates the intervention not of a few detachments, but of an entire Roman army. Given the range and magnitude of these activities, it is clear that traditional images of the Essenes and of the early church are woefully inadequate. It is equally clear that the movement which manifested itself through the Qumran community and the early church also manifested itself through other groups generally deemed to be separate. The Zadokites, for example, the Zealots, and the Sicarii. Eisenman's research has revealed the underlying simplicity of what had previously seemed a dauntingly complicated situation. As he says, terms like Ebionim, Nazrim, Hasidim, Zadokim, i.e., Ebionites, Palestinian Christians, Essenes, and Zadokites, in brackets, turn out to be variations on the same theme, while the various phraseologies the community at Qumran used to refer to itself, e.g., Sons of Light, do not all designate different groups, but function as interchangeable metaphors. The militant zealots and Sicarii will prove, similarly, to be variations on the same theme, manifestations of the same movement. This movement is militant, nationalistic, revolutionary, xenophobic, and messianic in character. Although rooted in Old Testament times, it coalesces during the Maccabean period of the 2nd century BC, but the events of the 1st century of the Christian era will imbue it with a new and particularly ferocious momentum. At the core of the movement lies the question of dynastic legitimacy. Legitimacy not just of the ruling house, but of the priesthood. In the beginning, indeed, priestly legitimacy is the more important. The legitimacy of the priesthood had become crucial in Old Testament times. It was supposed to descend lineally from Aaron through the tribe of Levi. Thus, throughout the Old Testament, the priesthood is the unique preserve of the Levites. The Levite high priests who attend David and Solomon are referred to as Zadok, though it is not clear whether this is a personal name or a hereditary title. Solomon is anointed by Zadok, thereby becoming the Anointed One, the Messiah, Hamashiach in Hebrew. But the high priests were themselves also anointed and were also, in consequence, messiahs. In Old Testament times, then the people of Israel are in effect governed by two parallel lines of messiahs or anointed ones. One of these lines presides over spiritual affairs and descends from the tribe of Levi through Aaron. The other, in the form of the kingship, presides over secular affairs and traces itself through David to the tribe of Judah. This, of course, explains the references in the Dead Sea Scrolls to the messiahs of Aaron and of Israel, or the Aaron and of David, or of Aaron and of David. The principle is essentially similar to that whereby, during the Middle Ages in Europe, Pope and Emperor were supposed to preside jointly over the Holy Roman Empire. The priestly line invoking a lineage from Aaron maintained their status until the Babylonian invasion of 587 BC. In 538 BC, when the Babylonian captivity ended, the priesthood quickly re-established itself, again claiming a descent, metaphorical if not literal, from Aaron. In 333 BC, however, Alexander the Great overran the Holy Land. For the next 160-odd years, Palestine was to be ruled by a succession of Hellenistic or Greek-oriented dynasties. I think that this is one contention I've always had with Eisenman. I think the use of the name Palestine is inappropriate at this time, in 333 BC. After all, it wouldn't be until Hadrian redubbed Judea Palestina in 130, what was it, 136, I believe? 136, right? And the name that he derived it from was Philistia, which is represented by present day Gaza. You know, they want to pretend like the whole territory of Canaan, right? The whole Levant was all called Palestine. That's just horseshit. It's not true. It never was true. And the name, as I said, Palestine, Philistine, was derived from Philistia. Philistia, who they were not Arabs. They were seafaring peoples who apparently were derived from what was it, Cyprus or Crete, one of the islands there. I think it was Cyprus, but they had no anyway. That name, that word, it's so deceptive, and Eisenman has no problem with using it to describe the land in these ancient times, which is, I think, it's just wrong and inappropriate. But then again, the position he's in, if he wanted to get anywhere through the universities, he better use that word that way. That's what we're living in now, folks. I mean, it's like a compliance to soothe the inflammation potential or something. It's stupid actually, but no, it is inappropriate. But I can understand why he does it. It just unnerves me though. Where are we? Okay, the priesthood during this period spawned a bewildering multitude of claimants, many of whom adapted partially or completely to Hellenistic ways of Hellenistic lifestyles, Hellenistic values and attitudes. As is often the case in such circumstances, the general liberalization tendency engendered a hardline conservative reaction. There arose a movement which deplored the relaxed, heterodox, and permissive atmosphere, the indifference to old traditions, the defilement and pollution of the ancient purity, the defiance of the sacred law. This movement undertook to rid Palestine of Hellenized collaborators and libertines who had, it was felt, by their very presence, desecrated the temple. According to the first book of Maccabees, the movement first asserted itself, probably around 167 BC. Then Mattathias Maccabeus, a country priest, was ordered by a Greek officer to sacrifice on a pagan altar in defiance of Judaic law. Enraged by this blasphemous sight, Mattathias, who burned with zeal for the law, 1 Maccabees 2:26 in brackets, summarily killed a fellow Jew who complied along with the Greek officer. In effect, as Eisenman had said, Mattathias thus became the first zealot. Immediately after his action in the temple, he raised the cry of revolt. Let everyone who is zealous for the law and supports the covenant come out with me. 1 Maccabees 2:27. In brackets. Thereupon he took to the countryside with his sons, Judas, Simon, Jonathan, and 2 others, as well as with an entourage called the Hasideans, mighty warriors of Israel. Every one who offered himself willingly for the law, in brackets, 1 Maccabees 2:42, and when Mattathias, a year or so later, lay on his deathbed, he exhorted his sons and followers to show zeal for the law and give your lives for the covenant of our fathers. In brackets, 1 Maccabees 2:50. On Mattathias' death, control of the movement passed to his son, Judas, who withdrew into the wilderness and lived like wild animals. in the hills with his companions, eating nothing but wild plants to avoid contracting defilement. 2 Maccabees 5:27. This attests to what will eventually become an important principle and ritual, that of purifying oneself by withdrawing into the wilderness and, as a species of initiation, living for a time in seclusion here. In seclusion. Actually, that's there's Jewish law for that. There's precedents for that where I can't give it to you word for word. I don't have the source, but it's basically, it states that if a temple defiles itself or the priesthood had become, unrighteous or whatever the case may be, there's a problem there, you're allowed to, retract and head into the desert for a spell to purify yourself. So this desert trip that you hear about the old Yids going through isn't just so they could see visions or, fast in the desert to get in touch with God. It was getting in touch with God, but there was a purification involved in the process, apparently. And actually, that law still stands to this day. It's still there. And if you get the right rabbi, he'll tell you about it, too. It's, those who really know Torah and the law. Here, Eisenman suggests, is the origin of remote communities such as Qumran, the first foundation of which dates from the Maccabean times. It is, in effect, the equivalent of the modern retreat. In the New Testament, of course, the supreme exemplar of self-purification and remote solitude is John the Baptist, who preached in the wilderness and ate locust and honey. But it must be remembered that Jesus, too, undergoes a probationary, initiatory experience in the desert. From the fastnesses to which they had withdrawn, Judas Maccabeus, his brothers, and his companions embarked on a prolonged campaign of guerrilla operations which escalated into a full-scale revolt and mobilized the people as a whole. By 152 BC, the Maccabeans had wrested control of the Holy Land, pacified the country, and installed themselves in power. Their first act on capturing the temple was to purify it by removing all pagan trappings. It is significant that though the Maccabees were simultaneously de facto kings and priests, the latter office was more important to them. They hastened to regularize their status in the priesthood as custodians of the law. They did not bother to call themselves kings until the fourth generation of their dynasty between 103 and 76 BC. From the bastion of the priesthood, the Maccabees promulgated the law with fundamentalist ferocity. They were fond of invoking the Old Testament legend of the covenant of Phinehas, which appears in the book of Numbers. Phinehas was said to be a priest and a grandson of Aaron, active after the Hebrews had fled Egypt under Moses and established themselves in Palestine. Shortly thereafter, their numbers are devastated by plague. Phinehas turns on one man in particular, who has taken a pagan foreigner to wife. Seizing a spear, he promptly dispatches the married couple. God, at that point, declares that Phinehas is the only man to have the same zeal as I have. And he makes a covenant with Phinehas. Henceforth, in reward for his zeal for his God, 1 Maccabees 2:54 in brackets, Phinehas and his descendants will hold the priesthood for all time. Such was the figure to whom the Maccabean priesthood looked as a role model. Like Phinehas, they condemned all relations of any kind with pagans and foreigners. Like Phinehas, they insisted on and sought to embody zeal for the law. This xenophobic antagonism to foreign ways, foreign wives, etc., was to be passed on as a legacy, and would seem to have been characteristic of the whole Zealot-Zadokite orientation. Whether the Maccabeans could claim a literal pedigree from Aaron and from David is not certain. Probably they couldn't. But their zeal for the law served to legitimize them. During their dynasty, therefore, Israel could claim both a priesthood and a monarchy that conformed more or less to the stringent criteria of Old Testament authority. All of this ended, of course, with the accession of Herod in 37 BC, installed as a puppet by the Romans who had overrun Palestine a quarter of a century before. At first, before he had consolidated his position, Herod was also preoccupied by questions of legitimacy. Thus, for example, he contrived to legitimize himself by marrying a Maccabean princess. No sooner was his position secure, however, than he proceeded to murder his wife and her brother, rendering the Maccabean line effectively extinct. He also removed or destroyed the upper echelons of priesthood, which he filled with his own favorites and minions. These are the Sadducees, known to history through biblical sources and through Josephus. Eisenman suggests that the term Sadducee was originally a variant or perhaps a corruption of Zadok or Zadokim, the righteous ones, in Hebrew, which the priesthood of the Maccabeans unquestionably were. The Sadducees, installed by Herod, were, however, very different. They were firmly aligned with the usurping monarch. They enjoyed an easy and comfortable life of prestige and privilege. They exercised a lucrative monopoly over the temple and everything associated with the temple. And they had no concept whatever of zeal for the law. Israel thus Israel thus found itself under the yoke of a corrupt, illegitimate monarchy and a corrupt, illegitimate priesthood, both of which were ultimately instruments of pagan Rome. As in the days of Mattathias Maccabeus, this situation inevitably provoked a reaction. If Herod's puppet priests became the Sadducees of popular tradition, their adversaries, the purists who remained zealous for the law, became known to history under a variety of different names. In certain contexts, the Qumran literature, for example, these adversaries were called Zadokites, or sons of Zadok. In the New Testament, they were called Nazarenes, and subsequently early Christians. In Josephus, they were called Zealots and Sicarii. The Romans, of course, regarded them as terrorists, outlaws, and brigands. In modern terminology, they might be called Messianic revolutionary fundamentalists. Whatever the terminology one uses, the religious and political situation in Judea had, by the beginning of the 1st century AD, provoked widespread opposition to the Herodian regime, the pro-Herodian priesthood, and the machinery of the Roman Empire, which sustained and loomed behind both. By the 1st century AD, there were thus two rival and antagonistic factions of Sadducees. On the one hand, there were the Sadducees of the New Testament and Josephus, the Herodian Sadducees. On the other hand, there was a true or purist Sadducee movement which repudiated all such collaboration and remained fervently loyal to three traditional governing principles: a priesthood or priestly Messiah claiming descent from Aaron, a royal Messiah claiming descent from David, and above all, zeal for the law. It will by this time have become clear to the reader that zeal for the law is not a casually used phrase. On the contrary, it is used very precisely in the way that such phrases as brethren of the craft might be used in Freemasonry, and whenever the phrase or some variant of it occurs, it offers a vital clue to the researcher, indicating to him a certain group of people or movement. Given this fact, it becomes strained and disingenuous to argue, as adherents of the consensus do, that there must be some distinction between the Qumran community, who extol zeal for the law, and the zealots of popular tradition. The zealots of popular tradition are generally acknowledged to have been founded at the dawn of the Christian era by a figure known as Judas of Galilee, or more accurately, perhaps, Judas of Gamala. Judas launched his revolt immediately after the death of Herod the Great in 4 BC. One particularly revealing aspect of this revolt is cited by Josephus. At once, as soon as mourning for Herod was over, public demand was whipped up for the incumbent Herodian high priest to be deposed and another of greater piety and purity to be installed in his place. Accompanied by a priest known as Sadok, apparently a Greek transliteration of Zadok, or, as suggested by Eisenman, Zadik, the Hebrew for righteous one, Judas and his followers promptly raided the royal armory in the Galilean city of Sepphoris, plundering weapons and equipment for themselves. Around the same time, either just before or just after, Herod's palace at Jericho near Qumran was attacked by arsonists and burned down. These events were to be followed by some 75 years of incessant guerrilla warfare and terrorist activity, culminating in the full-scale military operations of AD 66 to 73. In the Jewish Wars, written in the volatile aftermath of the revolt, Josephus states that Judas of Galilee had founded a peculiar sect of his own. Josephus' second major work, however, Antiquities of the Jews, was composed a quarter of a century or so later, when the general atmosphere was rather less fraught. In this work, therefore, Josephus could afford to be more explicit. He states that Judas and Sadok became zealous, implying something tantamount to a conversion to some recognized attitude or state of mind. Their movement, he says, constituted the fourth sect of Jewish philosophy, and the youth of Israel were zealous for it. From the very beginning, the movement was characterized by messianic aspirations. Zadok embodied the figure of the priestly Messiah, descended from Aaron. And Judas, according to Josephus, had an ambitious desire of the royal dignity, the status of the royal Messiah, descended from David. Judas himself appears to have been killed fairly early in the fighting. His mantle of leadership passed to his sons, of whom there were three. Two of them, Jacob and Simon, were well-known zealot leaders, captured and crucified by the Romans sometime between AD 46 and 48. The third son, or perhaps grandson, Menahem, was one of the chief instigators of the revolt of AD 66. In its early days, when the revolt still promised to be successful, Menahem is described as making a triumphal entry into Jerusalem, in the state of a king, another manifestation of messianic dynastic ambitions. In AD 66, Menahem also captured the fortress of Masada. The bastion's last commander, known to history as Eleazar, was another descendant of Judas of Galilee, though the precise nature of the relationship has never been established. The mass suicide of zealot defenders at Masada has become a familiar historical event, the focus of at least two novels, a cinema film, and a television miniseries. It has already been referred to in this book, and there will be occasion to look at it more closely shortly. Masada, however, was not the only instance of such mass suicide. In AD 67, responding to the rebellion sweeping the Holy Land, a Roman army advanced on Gamala in Galilee, the original home of Judas and his sons. 4,000 Jews died trying to defend the town. When their efforts proved futile, another 5,000 committed suicide. This reflects something more than mere political opposition. It attests to a dimension of religious fanaticism. Such a dimension is expressed by Josephus, who, speaking of the zealots, says, "They do not value dying any kinds of death, nor indeed do they heed the deaths of their relations and friends, nor can any such fear make them call any man Lord. To acknowledge a Roman emperor as a god, which Rome demanded, would have been for the zealots the most outrageous blasphemy. To such a transgression of the law, death would indeed have been preferable." Zeal for the law effectively brings the zealots, usually envisaged as more or less secular freedom fighters, into alignment with the fervently religious members of the Qumran community. And as we have already noted, Qumranic texts were found in the ruins of Masada. Zeal for the law also brings the zealots into alignment with the so-called early church, to whose adherents the same zeal is repeatedly ascribed. The figure cited in the Gospels as Simon Zelotes, or Simon the Zealot, attests to at least one zealot in Jesus' immediate entourage, and Judas Iscariot, whose name may well derive from the Sicarii, might be another. Most revealing of all, however, is Eisenman's discovery, the original Greek term used to denote members of the early church. They are called quite explicitly zelotai of the law, or zelotai. That is, zealots. There thus emerges in first-century Palestine a kind of fundamentalist dynastic priesthood claiming either genealogical or symbolic descents from Aaron and associated with the expected imminent advent of a Davidic or royal Messiah. This priesthood maintains itself in a state of perpetual self-declared war with the Herodian dynasty, the puppet priests of that dynasty, and the occupying Romans. Depending on their activities at a given moment and the perspective from which they are viewed, the priesthood and its supporters are variously called zealots, Essenes, Zadokites, Nazarenes, and a number of other things, including by their enemies brigands and outlaws. They are certainly not passive recluses and mystics. On the contrary, their vision, as Eisenman says, is violently apocalyptic and provides a theological corollary. On the contrary, their vision, as Eisenman says, is violently apocalyptic and provides a theological corollary to the violent action with which the zealots are usually associated. This violence, both political and theological, can be discerned in the career of John the Baptist, executed, according to the Gospels of Matthew and Mark, for condemning the marriage of Herod Antipas to his niece because it is against the law for you to have her. And indeed, Eisenman has even suggested that John the Baptist may have been the mysterious Zadok who accompanied Judas of Galilee, leader of the Zealots, at the time of Jesus' birth. To recapitulate, then, there emerge from the confusing welter of sobriquet the nomenclature, the configurations of a broad movement in which Essenes, Zadokites, Nazarenes, Zealots, and other such supposed factions effectively fuse. The names prove to be merely different designations, or at most different manifestations of the same religious and political impetus diffused throughout the Holy Land and beyond from the 2nd century BC on. The ostensibly separate factions would have been, at most, like the variety of individuals, groups, and interests which coalesced to form the single movement known as the French Resistance during the Second World War. At most, for Robert Eisenman personally, any distinction between them is but a matter of degree. They are all variations on the same theme, but even if some subtle gradations between them did exist, they would still have been unified by their joint involvement in a single ambitious enterprise, the ridding of their land of Roman occupation and the resentment of the old legitimate Judaic monarchy, together with its rightful priesthood. That enterprise, of course, did not end with the destruction of Jerusalem and Qumran between AD 68 and 70, nor with the fall of Masada in AD 74. In the immediate aftermath of the debacle, large numbers of Zealots and Sicarii fled abroad to places where there were sizable Judaic populations, to Persia, for example, and to Egypt, especially Alexandria. In Alexandria, they attempted to mobilize the local Jewish population for yet another uprising against Rome. They met with little success, some 600 of them being rounded up and handed over to the authorities. Men, women, and children were tortured in an attempt to make them acknowledge the emperor as a god. According to Josephus, not a man gave in or came near to saying it. And he adds, and here's the quote, "But nothing amazed the spectators as much as the behavior of young children, for not one of them could be constrained to call Caesar Lord. So far did the strength of the brave spirit prevail over the weakness of their little bodies." End of quote. Here again is a strain of fanatical dedication, a dedication that cannot be political in nature, that can only be religious. More than 60 years after the war that left Jerusalem and the temple in ruins, the Holy Land erupted again in a new revolt led by the charismatic messianic figure known as Simon Bar Kokhba, the son of the star. According to Eisenman, the terminology suggests that Simon was in reality descended by blood from the zealot leaders of the previous century. In any case, the image of the star had certainly figured prominently among them during the period culminating with the first revolt. And as we have noted, the same image figures repeatedly in the Dead Sea Scrolls. It derives ultimately from a prophecy in the book of Numbers, 24:17 in brackets. A star from Jacob takes the leadership, a scepter arises from Israel. The war rule invokes this prophecy and declares that the star or the Messiah will, together with the poor or the righteous, repel invading armies. Eisenman has found this star prophecy in two other crucial places in the Qumran literature. One, the Damascus document, is particularly graphic. The star is the interpreter of the law who shall come to Damascus, as it is written. The scepter is the prince. Josephus, as well as Roman historians, such as Suetonius and Tacitus, reports how a prophecy was current in the Holy Land during the early 1st century AD, to the effect that from Judea would go forth men destined to rule the world. According to Josephus, the promulgation of this prophecy was a major factor in the revolt of AD 66, and needless to say, the star prophecy finds its way into Christian tradition as the Star of Bethlehem, which heralds Jesus' birth. As son of the star, then, Simon Bar Kokhba enjoyed an illustrious symbolic pedigree. Unlike the revolt of AD 66, Simeon's insurrection, commencing in AD 132, was no ill-organized conflagration resulting, so to speak, from spontaneous combustion. On the contrary, much prolonged and careful planning went into the enterprise. Jewish smiths and craftsmen pressed into Roman service would, for example, deliberately forge slightly substandard weapons. When these were rejected by the Romans, they would be collected and stored for use by the rebels. From the war of the previous century, Simeon had also learned that there was no point in capturing and holding fortresses such as Masada. To defeat the Romans, a campaign based on mobility, on hit-and-run tactics would be necessary. This led to the construction of vast underground networks of rooms, corridors, and tunnels. In the period prior to the revolt, Simeon used these networks for training. Subsequently, once hostilities had begun, they served as bases and staging areas, enabling the rebels to launch a sudden lightning assault, then disappear. The kind of ambush with which American soldiers, to their cost, became familiar during the war in Vietnam. But Simeon did not confine himself solely to guerrilla operations. His army included many volunteers from abroad, many mercenaries and professional soldiers with considerable military experience. Indeed, surviving records discovered by archaeologists have revealed that a number of Simeon's officers and staff spoke only Greek. With such well-trained forces at his disposal, he could, on occasion, meet the Romans in pitched battle. Within the first year of the revolt, Simeon had destroyed at least one complete Roman legion, and probably a second. Palestine had been effectively cleared of Roman troops. Jerusalem had been recaptured and a Judaic administration installed there. The campaign came within a hair's breadth of total success. It failed primarily because Simeon was let down by his expected allies. According to his overall grand design, his troops were to be supported by forces from Persia, where a great many Jews still resided and enjoyed the sympathetic favor of the reigning dynasty. Just when Simeon most needed these reinforcements, however, Persia itself was invaded from the north by marauding hill tribes who effectively pinned down Persian resources, leaving Simeon bereft of his promised support. In Syria, safely outside Palestine, the Romans regrouped under the personal leadership of the Emperor Hadrian, with Julius Severus, formerly governor of Britain, as his second in command. Another full-scale invasion ensued involving as many as 12 legions, some 80,000 troops. In a two-pronged advance, they fought their way from post to post down the entire length of the Holy Land. Eventually, Simeon was cornered, making his last stand at Bether, his headquarters a few miles west of Jerusalem in AD 135. During the entire course of the revolt, Simeon's troops were in constant occupation of Qumran. Coins found in the ruins attest to their presence in what would, after all, have been a site of considerable strategic importance. It is thus possible, despite the claims of Father Devoe, that some, at least, of the Dead Sea Scrolls were deposited in Qumran as late as Simeon's time. 15. Zealot suicide. Once the broad messianic movement of the first century Palestine is seen in perspective, and once the apparently diverse sects are seen as integral parts of it, a number of hitherto inexplicable elements and anomalies slip into place. Thus, for example, the apocalyptic and eschatological ferocity of John the Baptist begins to make sense, as does his role in the events recounted by the Gospels. Thus, too, can one account for a number of theologically awkward passages and incidents pertaining to Jesus. Thus, too, can one account for a number of theologically awkward passages and incidents pertaining to Jesus' own career. There is, as we have noted, at least one zealot in his following, and possibly more. There is the violence of his action in overturning the tables of the money changers at the temple. There is his execution not by Judaic but by Roman authorities, in a fashion specifically reserved for political offenders. There are numerous other instances, which the authors of this book have examined at length elsewhere. Finally, there are Jesus' own words. And the quote, "Do not suppose that I have come to bring peace to the earth. It is not peace I have come to bring, but a sword. For I have come to set a man against his father, a daughter against her mother." Matthew 10:34-35. And more tellingly still, in unmistakably Qumranic phraseology, a second quote, "Do not imagine that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish, but to complete or fulfill them. Not one dot, not one little stroke shall disappear from the law until its purpose is achieved. Therefore, the man who infringes even one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be considered the least in the kingdom of heaven." Matthew 5:17-19. In this passage, it is almost as if Jesus had anticipated Paul's advent. Certainly, he could not have warned against it any more specifically. By the standards he lays down, Paul's status in the kingdom of heaven cannot be much higher than that of the official pariah in residence. Another anomaly that emerges in a fresh light is the fortress of Masada and the character and mentality of its tenacious defenders. When the Holy Land rose in revolt in AD 66, Masada was one of the first strongholds to be seized by Menahem, the son or grandson of Judas of Galilee, founder of the Zealots, perched high on a sheer-sided mountain overlooking the southwestern shore of the Dead Sea, some 33 miles below Qumran. The place becomes the rebels' most important bastion, the supreme symbol and embodiment of resistance. Long after that resistance had collapsed elsewhere, Masada continued to hold out. Jerusalem, for example, was occupied and razed within 2 years of the insurrection's outbreak in AD 68. Masada remained impregnable, however, until AD 74. From within its walls, some 960 defenders withstood repeated assaults and a full-scale siege by a Roman army estimated to have numbered 15,000. Despite the tenacity of this resistance, Masada's position by the middle of April AD 74 had become hopeless. Cut off from the reinforcement, entirely encircled by Roman troops, the garrison no longer had any prospect of withstanding a general assault. The besieging Romans, after bombarding the fortress with heavy siege machinery, had constructed an immense ramp running up the mountainside, and on the night of the 15th of April prepared for their final onslaught. The garrison, under the command of Eleazar ben Yair, came to their own decision. The men killed their wives and children. 10 men were then chosen to kill their comrades. Having done so, they proceeded to draw lots, choosing one to dispatch the remaining 9. After he had performed his task, he set fire to what remained of the buildings in the main fortress and killed himself. Altogether, 960 men, women, and children perished. When the Romans burst through the gate the following morning, they found only corpses amid the ruins. 2 women and 5 children escaped the carnage, supposedly having hidden in the water conduits under the fortress, while the rest of the garrison killed themselves. Josephus recounts the testimony of one of the women, drawing, he says, on her interrogation by Roman officers. According to Josephus, she furnished a detailed account of what transpired on the last night of the siege. If this account is to be believed, and there is no reason why it shouldn't, Eleazar, the commander of the fortress, exhorted his followers to their mass suicide by his charismatic and persuasive eloquence. And there's a quote here. Ever since primitive man began to think, the words of our ancestors and of the gods, supported by the actions and spirits of our forefathers, have constantly impressed on us that life is the calamity for man, not death. Death gives freedom to our souls and lets them depart to their own pure home, where they will know nothing of any calamity. But while they are confined within a mortal body and share its miseries, in strict truth, they are dead. For association of the divine with the mortal is most improper. Certainly the soul can do a great deal when imprisoned in the body. It makes the body its own organ of sense, moving it invisibly and impelling it in its actions further than mortal nature can reach. But when freed from the weight that drags it down to earth and is hung about it, the soul returns to its own place. Then in truth it partakes of a blessed power and an utterly unfettered strength, remaining as invisible to human eyes as God himself. Not even while it is in the body can it be viewed. It enters undetected and departs unseen, having itself one imperishable nature, but causing a change in the body, for whatever the soul touches lives and blossoms. Whatever it deserts withers and dies. Such is the superabundance it has of immortality. End of the quote. According to Josephus, Eleazar concludes, "Let us die unenslaved by our enemies, and leave this world as free men in company with our wives and children. That is what the law ordains." On occasion, Josephus is unreliable. When he is so, however, it shows. In this instance, there is certainly no reason to doubt his word, and the excavations of Masada conducted in the 1960s tend to support his versions of events. It is, of course, probable that he embellished Eleazar's speeches somewhat, making them perhaps more eloquent and long-winded, than they might actually have been, availing himself of some poetic license. But the general tenor of the narrative rings true and has always been accepted by historians. What is more, Josephus had a unique and first-hand understanding of the mentality that dictated the mass suicide at Masada. At the beginning of the revolt, he himself had been a rebel commander in Galilee. In AD 67, his forces were besieged by the Romans under Vespasian at Jotapata, now Jotaphat, near Sepphoris. When the town fell, many of its defenders committed suicide rather than submit to capture. Many others, including Josephus himself, fled and hid in caves. According to his own account, he found himself in one cave with 40 other fugitives. Here, as at Masada, lots were drawn as to who would kill his comrades, whether by chance, as Josephus suggests, or by the providence of God, or perhaps by a fiddle which aided and abetted one or the other. He and another man ended up as the sole survivors. Persuading his companion to surrender, he then himself defected to the victorious Romans. He does not emerge from the adventure in any very credible light, of course. But even if he himself could not live up to them, he was no stranger to zealot attitudes, including their preparedness for self-immolation in the name of the law. In reality, there was a fairly sophisticated logic governing such self-immolation, which would not have been readily apparent to Josephus's readers, either at the time or subsequently. The mass suicides at Masada, at Gamala, and at other sites are explained by Eisenman as resting ultimately on the uniquely zealot concept of resurrection. This concept, derived primarily from the Old Testament prophets Daniel and Ezekiel, both of whose texts were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran. Daniel 12:2 in brackets, was the first to give expression to the concept in any developed form. Of those who lie sleeping in the dust of the earth, many will awake, some to everlasting life, some to shame and everlasting disgrace. He speaks, too, of an imminent kingdom of heaven, and of end times, of the coming of an anointed prince, of a son of man, on whom was conferred sovereignty. Daniel 7, verses 13 and 14. In Ezekiel, the relevant passage is the famous vision of the valley filled with dry bones, all of which God announces will live again. The quote, "I mean to raise you from your graves and lead you back to the soil of Israel, and you will know that I am Yahweh, when I open your graves and raise you from your graves. And I shall put my spirit in you, and you will live." Ezekiel 37, verses 12 to 14. End of the quote. So important was the passage deemed to be that a copy of it was found buried under the floor of the synagogue at Masada. The concept of resurrection derived from Daniel and Ezekiel was picked up and adopted by the original zealots for the law, the Maccabees. Thus, in the second book of Maccabees, it is used to encourage martyrdom for the sake of the law. In 2 Maccabees 14:42, an elder of Jerusalem kills himself rather than be captured and suffer outrages. In 2 Maccabees 6:18 ff, a priest and teacher of the law kills himself as an example of how to make a good death for the venerable and holy laws. This incident, according to Eisenman, is the prototype for the establishment of later zealot mentality. The principle finds its fullest expression in 2 Maccabees, where 7 brothers submit to death by torture rather than transgress the law. Said one brother, "You may discharge us from this present life, but the King of the world will raise us up, since it is for his laws that we die, to live again forever." Another said, "It was heaven that gave me these limbs. For the sake of his laws I disdain them. From him I hope to receive them again." The next said to his tormentors, "Ours is the better choice, to meet death at men's hands, yet relying on God's promise that we shall be raised up by him. Whereas for you there can be no resurrection, no new life." End of the quote. Here, then, in the pre-Christian book of Maccabees, is the principle of bodily resurrection that will figure so prominently in later Christian theology. It is available, however, as the third of the above speeches makes clear, only to the righteous, to those zealous for the law. But there is another point of relevance in the passage devoted to the death of the 7 brothers. Just before the last of them is to be executed, his mother is brought in to see him. She has been urged to plead with him to submit and thereby save himself. Instead, she says to him that in the day of mercy I may receive you back in your brother's company. At the end of time, Those who die together will be resurrected together. Thus, Eleazar, in his exhortation to the garrison of Masada, urges them to die in company with our wives and children. That is what the law ordains, not the law of the Sadducee establishment or of later Judaism, only the law of the so-called Zealots. Had the women and children in the fortress been left alive, they would not have been exterminated by the victorious Romans, but they would have been separated from their menfolk and from each other, and many of them would have been enslaved, raped, consigned to Roman army brothels, and nearby defiled, bereft of their ritual purity according to the law. At Masada, separation and defilement were feared more than death, since death, for the righteous, would have been only temporary. Here, then, among the ferocious defenders of Masada is a principle of bodily resurrection, virtually identical to that of later Christianity. The garrison who defeated Masada can hardly be reconciled with traditional images of placid, peace-loving Essenes, who, according to adherents of the consensus, made up the community at Qumran. And indeed, as we have noted, adherents of the consensus continue to insist that no connection can possibly have existed between the Qumran community and the garrison at Masada, despite the discovery at Masada of texts identical to some of those found at Qumran, and in at least 2 instances found nowhere else. And despite the use by the defenders of Masada of precisely the same calendar as that used by the Qumran material, a unique solar calendar in contrast to the lunar calendar of the official Sadducee establishment and of later rabbinical Judaism. Once again, there can be discerned the configuration of what Eisenman has described, a broad messianic nationalistic movement in which a number of supposed factions, if there was ever any distinction between them, effectively merged. Eisenman's explanation accommodates and accounts for what has previously seemed a welter of contradictions and anomalies. It makes sense, too, of the mission on which Paul is dispatched by James and the hierarchy of the so-called early church. The Nazarene enclave. That would be the Nazarene enclave in Jerusalem. In biblical times, it must be remembered, Israel was not just a territory, not just a particular tract of land. Even more important, Israel denoted a people, a tribe, a host. When Paul and other evangelists are sent forth by the hierarchy in Jerusalem, their purpose is to make converts to the law, that is, to Israel. What would this have meant in practical terms if not the recruitment of an army? Since Old Testament times, and especially since the Babylonian captivity, the tribe of Israel had been scattered across the Mediterranean world and beyond, on into Persia, where at the time of Simeon Bar Kokhba's rising in AD 132, there was still enough sympathy to elicit at least a promise of support. Were not the emissaries of the Jerusalem hierarchy sent to tap this potentially immense source of manpower, to call to the colors the dispersed people of Israel, to drive the Roman invaders from their native soil and liberate their homeland? And Paul, in preaching a wholly new religion rather than mustering recruits, was in effect depoliticizing, demilitarizing, and emasculating the movement. This would, of course, have been a far more serious matter than merely lapsing from dogma or certain ritual observances. It would have been, in fact, a form of treason, for the law, as it figures in the Dead Sea Scrolls, is not wholly confined to dogma and ritual observances. Running throughout the Qumran texts, as a sacred duty, there is clearly a thrust to build a legitimate messianic persona, whether royal or priestly or both. By implication, this would involve the reestablishment of the ancient monarchy and priesthood, to drive out the invader, to reclaim and purify the Holy Land for the people chosen by God to inhabit it. In the words of the War Scroll, the dominion of the in square brackets, invaders, shall come to an end. The sons of righteousness shall shine over all the ends of the earth. (16) Paul, Roman agent or informer. With this grand design in mind, it is worth looking again at the confused and sketchy description of the events that occur towards the end of the Acts of the Apostles. Paul, it will be remembered, after a prolonged evangelistic mission abroad, has again been summoned to Jerusalem by James and the irate hierarchy. Sensing trouble, his immediate supporters exhort him repeatedly at each stage of his itinerary not to go. But Paul, never a man to shrink from a confrontation, remains deaf to their appeals. Meeting with James and other members of the community's leadership, he is again castigated for laxity in his observation of the law. Acts does not record Paul's response to these charges, but it would appear from what follows that he perjures himself, denying the accusations against him, which his own letters reveal to have been justified. In other words, he recognizes the magnitude of his offense, and however fierce his integrity, however fanatic his loyalty to his version of Jesus, he acknowledges that some sort of compromise is this time necessary. Thus, when asked to purify himself for 7 days and thereby demonstrate the unjustness of the allegations against him, he readily consents to do so. Eisenman suggests that James may have been aware of the true situation and that Paul may have well been set up. Had he refused the ritual of purification, he would have declared himself openly in defense of the law. By acceding to the ritual, he became even more than before the liar of the Habakkuk commentary. Whatever the course of action he chose, he would have damned himself, which may have been precisely what James intended. In any case, and despite his exculpatory self-purification, Paul continues to inspire enmity in those zealous for the law, who, a few days later, attack him in the temple. This, they proclaim, is the man who preaches to everyone, everywhere, against the law. Acts 21:28 in brackets. The ensuing riot is no minor disturbance, and here is the quote. This roused the whole city. People came running from all sides. They seized Paul and dragged him out of the temple, and the gates were closed behind them. They would have killed him if a report had not reached the tribune of the cohort that there was rioting all over Jerusalem. Acts 21, verses 30 to 31. End of the quote. The cohort is called out, no fewer than 600 men, and Paul, in the nick of time, is rescued, presumably to prevent civil upheaval on an even greater scale. Why else would the cohort bother to save the life of one Orthodox Jew who'd incurred the wrath of his fellows? Why else would the cohort bother to save the life of one heterodox Jew who'd incurred the wrath of his fellows? The sheer scale of the tumult attests to the kind of currency, influence, and power the so-called early church must have exercised in Jerusalem at the time. Among Jews, clearly, we are dealing with a movement within Judaism itself, which commands loyalty from much of the city's populace. Having rescued him from the incensed mob, the Romans arrest Paul, who, before he is marched off to prison, asks permission to make a self-exonerating speech. Inexplicably, the Romans acquiesce to his request, even though the speech serves only to further inflame the mob. Paul is then carried off for torture and interrogation. As was asked previously, interrogation about what? Why torture and interrogate a man who has offended his co-religionists on fine points of orthodoxy and ritual observance? There is only one explanation for the Romans taking such an interest, that Paul is suspected of being privy to information of political and or military nature. The only serious political and or military adversaries confronting the Romans were the adherents of the nationalistic movement, the zealots of popular tradition, and Paul, the evangelist of the early church, was under threat from those zealous for the law, 40 or more of them in number, who were plotting to kill him, vowing not to eat or drink until they had done so. Saved from this fate by his hitherto unmentioned nephew, he is bundled under escort out of Jerusalem to Caesarea, where he invokes his right as a Roman citizen to make a personal appeal to the emperor. While in Caesarea, he hobnobs in congenial and intimate fashion with the Roman procurator, Antonius Felix. Eisenman has emphasized that he is also intimate with the procurator's brother-in-law, Herod Agrippa II, and with the king's sister, later the mistress of Titus, the Roman commander who will destroy Jerusalem and eventually become emperor. These are not the only suspicious elements looming in the background of Paul's biography. From the very beginning, his apparent wealth, his Roman citizenship, and his easy familiarity with presiding establishment have differentiated him from his fellows and from other members of the early church. Obviously, he has influential connections with the ruling elite. How else could so young a man have become the high priest hatchetman? In his letter to the Romans, 1611, moreover, he speaks of a companion strikingly named Herodian, a name obviously associated with the reigning dynasty and the most unlikely for a fellow evangelist. The Acts 13:1 refer to one of Paul's companions in Antioch as Manaen, who had been brought up with Herod the Tetrarch. That would be Manaen, M-A-N-A-E-N, Manaen. Here again there is evidence of high-level aristocratic affiliation. Startling though the suggestion may be, it does seem at least possible that Paul was some species of Roman agent. Eisenman was led to this conclusion by the scrolls themselves, then found the references in the New Testament to support it. And indeed, if one combines and superimposes the materials found at Qumran with those in Acts, together with obscure references in Paul's letters, such a conclusion becomes a distinct possibility. But there is another possibility as well, possibly no less startling. Those last muddled and enigmatic events in Jerusalem, the nick-of-time intervention of the Romans, Paul's heavily escorted departure from the city, his sojourn in luxury at Caesarea, his mysterious and utter disappearance from the stage of history, these things find a curious echo in our own era. One is reminded of beneficiaries of the Witness Protection Program in the States. One is also reminded of the so-called supergrass phenomenon in Northern Ireland. In both cases, a member of an illicit organization dedicated to organized crime or to parliamentary terrorism is turned by the authorities. He consents to give evidence and testify in exchange for immunity, protection, relocation, and money. Like Paul, he would incur the vengeful wrath of his colleagues. Like Paul, he would be placed under seemingly disproportionate military and or police protection. Like Paul, he would be smuggled out under escort. Having cooperated with the authorities, he would then be given a new identity, and together with his family, resettled somewhere theoretically out of reach of his vindictive comrades. So far as the world at large was concerned, he would, like Paul, disappear. Does Paul then belong in the company of his history's secret agents? Of history's informers and supergrasses? These are some of the questions generated by Robert Eisenman's research. But in any case, Paul's arrival on the scene set a train of events in motion that was to prove irreversible. What began as a localized movement within the framework of existing Judaism, its influence extending no further than the Holy Land, was transformed into something of a scale and magnitude that no one at the time can have foreseen. The movement entrusted to the early church and the Qumran community was effectively hijacked and converted into something that could no longer accommodate its progenitors. There emerged a skein of thought which, heretical at its inception, was to evolve in the course of the next 2 centuries into an entirely new religion. What had been heresy within the framework of Judaism was now to become the orthodoxy of Christianity. Few accidents of history can have had more far-reaching consequences.